It started as one of those let's escape life for a bit trips. You know the type. Just two friends heading into the great outdoors to unplug. Jake and I had been friends since high school. And while we were different in a lot of ways, we balanced each other out. He was the adventurous type, always chasing the next thrill, while I was, well, let's just say I preferred my adventures with a controller in hand and a cold soda nearby. But Jake had this way of convincing me. "Come on," he'd said, "a weekend in the woods will be good for you." I gave in. We packed the essentials: tent, sleeping bags, food, water, a first aid kit, and drove 3 hours to some national park Jake had read about online. It wasn't one of the big, touristy ones. He promised me it was quieter, more remote. No crowds, no distractions, he said. Just us and nature. The drive there was honestly great. Music blaring, windows down, laughing about stupid stuff. Everything felt easy, normal. We got to the trailhead in the late afternoon. The air was crisp, and the trees stretched so high it felt like they could touch the clouds. "See," Jake said, grinning as he hoisted his pack. "Told you it'd be worth it." We hiked about 2 hours before setting up camp in a small clearing. The place was perfect. A flat patch of ground surrounded by towering pines, with just enough open sky to let in some starlight. Jake built the fire while I wrestled with the tent. We joked, we ate, and for the first time in a while, I actually felt relaxed. But then the first weird thing happened. It was subtle at first. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched long and thin, I noticed how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, eerie quiet. No bird song, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of animals. Just nothing. Like the forest had gone still, holding its breath. I mentioned it to Jake, but he waved it off. "We're probably just not used to it," he said. "City noise and all that." Maybe he was right. I didn't push it. That night, though, I woke up to something strange. At first, I thought it was a dream. A soft shuffling sound like footsteps, just outside the tent. I lay there, holding my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, closer, then it stopped. "Jake," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He grunted, half asleep. "Do you hear that?" He sat up, blinking. The sound started again, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the tent. Jake grabbed the flashlight, unzipped the flap, and shined the beam outside. "Hello?" he called. The light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. No movement, no tracks, just the faint outline of the trees swaying in the night breeze. "Probably an animal," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. We zipped up the tent and tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us. The next morning, things got stranger. While Jake was packing up our gear, I decided to explore the clearing. That's when I found it, a small circle of stones about 20 feet from our tent. At first, I thought it was just a fire pit someone had built, but there was no ash, no burn marks. In the center of the circle was a pile of bones. Small ones. Animal bones, I hoped. "Dude, check this out," I called. Jake came over, squinting at the arrangement. "Hikers?" he said, brushing it off. "People do weird stuff in the woods." But something about it didn't sit right with me. The stones were too perfectly placed, the bones too neatly stacked. It felt deliberate, ritualistic almost. "Let's just keep moving," I said, trying to shake off the unease. Jake nodded, for once not arguing. We spent the day hiking deeper into the forest. The trail wasn't well marked, and it became clear pretty quickly that this wasn't a place people frequented. The trees grew denser, the light dimmer, and the air heavier. I started to notice strange things, carvings on the trees, faint but intricate symbols scratched into the bark. Jake shrugged them off as graffiti, but I wasn't so sure. By late afternoon, we stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. An old abandoned cabin. It was small, barely more than a shack, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The windows were shattered, the door hung crooked on its hinges, and the wood was blackened, like it had been burned but never fully consumed. "We have to check it out," Jake said, already heading for the door. "Are you kidding me?" I said. "This is how horror movies start." He laughed, pushing the door open. The inside was worse. The air was damp and cold, smelling of rot and something metallic. The walls were covered in carvings, more of those strange symbols, overlapping and jagged. In the center of the room was a crude wooden figure, almost like a scarecrow, but twisted and wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too small, and it was wrapped in what looked like animal hides. Jake joked about it being some kind of witchcraft thing, but I wasn't laughing. My chest felt tight, like the air itself didn't want us there. "Let's go," I said, backing out of the cabin. For once, Jake didn't argue. That night, the woods came alive. We set up camp far from the cabin, but the unease lingered. The firelight flickered strangely, casting shadows that didn't make sense. The whispering started just after sundown, soft at first like wind through the trees. But as the night wore on, it grew louder, more distinct. "Help me." It was a woman's voice, clear and pleading. I froze, my heart racing. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Jake nodded, his face pale. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. No answer. Just the crackling of the fire and the oppressive silence of the forest. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. The figure stepped closer, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. Not fully human, not fully animal. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. The firelight barely illuminated it, but I could make out enough: pale, almost translucent skin stretched taut over its bones, and eyes, deep, hollow sockets that seemed to absorb the light. Jake grabbed my arm. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. We didn't move, didn't breathe. The figure stood there, swaying slightly, its head tilted as if listening. Then with a sudden jerking motion, it turned and disappeared into the trees. "We're leaving," I said, breaking the silence. Jake nodded, for once not arguing. We quickly packed up our things, our movements clumsy and frantic. The whispering started again, louder now, and coming from all around us. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was insistent, angry. As we strapped on our packs, something heavy hit the ground nearby. A rock, then another. We looked up and saw them, dozens of those twisted wooden effigies hanging from the trees, their crude forms swaying in the windless air. "This isn't real," Jake muttered, more to himself than to me, but it was. Every nerve in my body screamed for us to run, but the trail back was barely visible in the dark. "Stick together," I said, gripping the flashlight tightly. We started walking, fast but careful. The whispering followed us, growing louder with each step. Shadows darted in the corners of my vision, too fast to track. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement, a flash of pale skin, a glint of hollow eyes. Then Jake tripped. I turned to help him up, but he was staring at something on the ground, his face pale. "What is that?" he whispered. It was a hand, a human hand, severed at the wrist, lying half buried in the dirt. The fingers were bent, as if reaching for something. My stomach churned, and I pulled Jake to his feet. "We need to go. Now." We ran. The trail blurred as the trees closed in around us, their branches clawing at our faces and arms. The whispering turned into a roar, an overwhelming cacophony of voices, each more desperate and angry than the last. I could barely hear my own thoughts over the noise. Then the figure appeared again, blocking our path. This time, it was closer. I could see its face, or what was left of it. Its mouth was a gaping hole, lined with jagged, rotting teeth. It let out a sound, not quite a scream, not quite a growl, but something in between. My legs froze, and for a moment, I thought we were done for. Jake snapped me out of it, grabbing my arm and yanking me to the side. "This way!" he shouted, pulling me off the trail and into the dense underbrush. We ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. When we finally stopped, the woods were eerily quiet again. I leaned against a tree, trying to catch my breath. "Do you think we lost it?" I asked. Jake didn't answer. He was staring at something in the distance, his face ashen. I followed his gaze and felt my heart drop. The cabin. Somehow we'd circled back to it. "That's not possible," I said, shaking my head. We were running in the opposite direction. Jake didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the cabin, his body rigid. I turned back to it, and that's when I saw the door. It was open. Just a crack, but enough to see the darkness inside. "Don't," I said as Jake took a step forward. "Don't go in there." He didn't listen. Something about the way he moved wasn't right, like he was being pulled, his steps slow and deliberate. "Jake!" I shouted, grabbing his arm. He turned to me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in his eyes, something hollow, something not him. "Let me go," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "No," I shouted, pulling him back. The cabin door slammed shut, as if reacting to us. The force of it echoed through the forest, and the whispering returned, louder and more furious than before. Jake snapped out of it, blinking rapidly. What just happened?" "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "But we need to leave. Now." The woods didn't let us go easily. The trail twisted and turned, never leading where it should. The trees seemed to close in, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the moonlight. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker with each step. And then we heard it, the scream. High-pitched and inhuman, it tore through the air, freezing us in our tracks. It was followed by a sound like footsteps, but heavier, faster. Something was coming, and it was closing in. The scream was closer now, impossibly loud, like it was inside my head. My legs moved on autopilot, my body running before my mind could catch up. Jake was ahead of me, his flashlight swinging wildly as he tore through the underbrush. "Don't look back," he shouted, his voice raw with panic. But I did. I wish I hadn't. The thing was chasing us. Long, spindly limbs moving unnaturally fast, its pale, twisted form almost gliding through the trees. its hollow eyes locked onto mine. And for a moment, I felt like I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whispering turned into a deafening roar, 1,000 angry voices screaming in unison. "Run!" Jake's voice snapped me out of it. I turned and sprinted, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Somehow, we made it to the edge of the woods. The trees thinned, and the faint glow of the parking lot lights came into view. Relief surged through me, briefly. Then I heard it. A soft guttural sound, almost like laughter. I glanced back one last time, and there it was, standing just beyond the tree line. It didn't follow us out. It just stood there watching, its twisted form blending into the shadows. We didn't stop running until we were in the car, the doors locked, the engine roaring to life. Jake floored it, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped away. Neither of us spoke. The silence in the car was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. We didn't stop driving until we were hours away from the forest. Jake pulled into a gas station, his hands shaking as he turned off the engine. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. I didn't want one. For weeks after we got home, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Stress, sleep deprivation, overactive imagination, anything to make sense of what happened. But the nightmares wouldn't stop. Every night I saw it, the hollow eyes, the twisted body, the way it moved. And every night I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Jake wasn't doing any better. He stopped answering my calls, stopped showing up to work. When I finally went to check on him, his apartment was a mess. Food left out to rot, curtains drawn, every light in the place turned on. He looked awful, like he hadn't slept in days. "It followed us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "I see it," he said, staring at the dark corner of the room. "In the shadows, it's watching me." I wanted to tell him he was imagining things, but I couldn't, because I'd started seeing it too. At first, it was just glimpses, a shadow in the corner of my eye, a faint movement in the mirror, but it was there, always there. The last time I saw Jake was 3 weeks after the trip. He called me in the middle of the night, his voice frantic. "It's here," he said. "It's in my apartment." I drove over as fast as I could, but when I got there, the door was open, the apartment empty. No sign of Jake, just those strange, twisted carvings scratched into the walls. The police called it a missing person case. They said he probably ran off, but I knew better. Jake didn't run. He was taken. It's been 6 months since that trip, and I haven't been back to the woods. I've tried to move on, to forget, but it won't let me. The thing, whatever it is still with me. It doesn't show itself outright, but I feel it. In the quiet moments, in the dark corners of my apartment, in the whispers just on the edge of hearing. Sometimes I think about going back to the forest, about facing it, ending this once and for all. But deep down, I know it wouldn't help. Whatever we saw out there, whatever followed us, it doesn't belong to the woods. It belongs to us now, and it's never letting go.